Alright, let's go to the next one. This one is another suggestion from you guys. So this is about the Starliner from Boeing. Because you know how much I love me the science stuff, especially the space stuff. So this is I'm curious what this has to say about the Starliner, and I guess the problem that it's been having with its command capsule module. That's okay, you're a dog. I have no fear. I have no fear of Boeing. Do not worry. Haha. Because I'm not whistleblowing on him, so I have nothing to fear. No, too lazy? I have not. I'm afraid I don't know what that is.
It was a bright and sunny day at Florida's Cape.
Oh, Jesus, it's the same guy. I didn't even realize it was the same guy. Oh, well. It's a different channel, so what the hell? We'll still watch him.
Canaveral Space Force Station when at 10:52 a.m. local time, a great and powerful reaction began. As a combination of liquid oxygen and RP-1 rocket fuel began burning at the heart of its Common Core booster, an Atlas V rocket achieved liftoff. Aboard the rocket were two veteran astronauts of America's National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, 61-year-old Butch Wilmore of Tennessee and 58-year-old Sunita Williams of Massachusetts. They were on course to make a journey well-traveled by a generation of astronauts, ascending into orbit in advance of a rendezvous with the International Space Station. But the journey that Williams and Wilmore made wasn't just extraordinary because of the role they fulfill or the rocket they rode upon. In fact, the thing that really mattered was
If you guys remember, we watched the capsule's approach live on stream one time a few weeks ago. I actually had the capsule's approach to the ISS on stream, like in the opening of my stream of several weeks back. We were watching it live.
Was the vessel they rode inside, a space capsule so long awaited and so terribly beleaguered that its ascension into the cosmos was a matter of global news. Its name is the Boeing Starliner, and after years of delays, well over $1 billion lost and a long series of black eyes for the already struggling Boeing Corporation, it's finally in business. So on today's special episode of Astrographics, we're going to be taking a closer look at the Starliner, what it is, how it's made, what it means for the future of global space travel, and what it means for a certain aerospace giant here on Earth. The genesis of the Boeing Starliner goes all the way back to 2010, the same year of the birth of Instagram, the oil spill at Deepwater.
Well, I mean, Matthias, when it comes to space travel, that's true for anybody. If they screwed up even a little bit, it could end up being completely catastrophic. There's very little room for error when it comes to spaceflight. I mean, if you remember, when I had the live footage up on stream, they were having an issue with the capsule's thrusters. Like they were actually we were watching them trying to do diagnostics on thrusters because one of the thrusters would not fire. So that's bad. For space travel, that's fucking scary. That your maneuvering thrusters don't work. Because if that's because they have to be something like, if your maneuvering thrusters don't work properly, you can't get properly lined up for your descent into the planet. And you could burn up on entry because you're at a bad angle because your thrusters aren't working.
Deepwater Horizon and the formation of One Direction. Fun fact, in that year, administrators at NASA kicked off an initiative called the Commercial Crew Program. Designed to take spaceflight exploration into the private sector, the Commercial Crew Program would provide the United States the means to launch its own astronauts into space from its own soil again, after the Space Shuttle program would conclude in 1 year's time. Not only that, but it would alleviate the burden of actually paying for such things from the American taxpayer at a time when the United States was still reeling from the shock of recession. Per NASA, American American private industry would eventually prove that it was a safe, reliable, responsible, and cost-effective way to get to orbit, pulling together the brightest and best compensated minds of the private sector for an initiative that could see America return to the moon and perhaps go even further. A handful of companies put forward their own designs in NASA's selection competition, all offering capsules and spacecraft that could take humans back and forth to and from the International Space Station. Blue Origin offered a nose cone capsule, and the Sierra Nevada Corporation offered the Dream Chaser, a spaceplane that was
Not to lie, that actually looks kind of cool. You guys might have a hard time seeing it, but the Dream Chaser, not gonna lie, it looks kind of cool.
envisioned as a clear spiritual successor to the space shuttle that it would replace. But after years of work and intense competition, just 2 companies would ultimately get the nod from NASA in 2014. Those companies were SpaceX, offering a crude modification of its Dragon capsule, and Boeing, offering what was designated the CST-100, better known as the Starliner. Now, we're not going to get into the history of the Dragon capsule here, or
Albert, that is tough to say. Because that is very tough to say what is more dangerous, because they both have extremely hazardous pitfalls. If you fuck up going into orbit, you've now launched your vessel into deep space, with it being questionable whether or not you can make it back, depending, with that capsule, it'd be questionable if you could make it back if you went off course into deep space. Re-entry also has an extremely dangerous pitfalls in that you probably do have more chances of fucking up upon re-entry, because the 2 biggest pitfalls that I can think of right off the top of my head with re-entry is, number 1, you come in at a bad angle, and upon re-entry, you are not oriented, so your heat tiles are taking the brunt of the friction when entering into the atmosphere, and thus protecting the vessel and its occupants. So if you are at a wrong angle, you don't have that heat-resistant tiling taking the brunt of it, and you're now basically turning your vessel into a crispy critter, along with the people inside of it. The other problem with re-entry that you have to be extremely careful of is if your angle is off, you will not actually have re-entry. You will skip off the fucking atmosphere and go flying off into space. If your angle of entry is too shallow. So too deep, you're gonna fry yourself. Too shallow, you'll skip off and go spitting off into space and never come back. So from the sheer amount of issues that you could potentially run into, I mean, granted, getting into orbit, well, there's the problem of, do you have enough thrust to actually make it up there in the first place, and not just kind of lose your thrust before you get into orbit trajectory and crash, or do you go too far? Out of those 2, off the top of my head, I would say the re-entry probably has far less room for error than the entering orbit part. That would be my suspicion. Now, again, I am not an aeronautics expert. I am not an astrophysicist, so these are not my specialties. This is just me knowing something about what's going on here and thinking about it logically. Logically speaking, I would think that based on those factors, the re-entry might be considered more dangerous by a slight margin. A slight margin.
Although do let us know in the comments if you'd like to see that story in a separate episode. Instead, we'll keep a focus on the Starliner here, a project for which Boeing was handed a fat $4.2 billion check upon selection. Upon receiving that funding, Boeing set its plans in motion, hoping to convert their designs into a functioning spacecraft as quickly as possible. The spacecraft they were working on would have to fulfill a few fundamental criteria. It would have to be able to maintain a stable, safe, crewed interior environment for orbital flight. It would have to be able to achieve, sustain, and depart from low Earth orbit, and it would have to be able to do all the normal spacecraft things like surviving re-entry and transporting cargo. It would need to be compatible with NASA's docking systems and a range of launch vehicles, and as of 2014, it was expected to include at least one seat for a space tourist. Because, of course it was, we're talking the mid-2010s here, the space flight for rich people era of scientific speculation.
Thank you, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, for putting that fucking idea in people's heads.
Per Boeing executive Kelly Kaplan, the Starliner was intended to feature autonomous docking features with the ISS, and it would be designed with an alternate use in mind to transport cargo while uncrewed. It would ride primarily on the back of an Atlas V rocket, a well-tested program made in parallel by Boeing and Lockheed Martin under the joint venture United Rocket Alliance. Testing for the various components of the Starliner kicked off all the way back in 2011.
Yeah, the idea might have been in their heads already, but Elon and Jeff really supercharged it by them actually doing low Earth orbit tourist flights, basically. So I mean they kind of supercharged the idea.
While the project was still in its early phases. Expected to use an airbag cushioning system to end its parachute descent back to Earth, a test version of the craft was hurled repeatedly into the sands of the Mojave Desert, while other versions were parachuted down from high altitude. Mock-ups for the craft would see visits from NASA astronauts who had the pleasure of playing around inside it for a bit and pointing out design elements that could better serve a flight crew's needs. Once the major NASA checks came in, the test capsules were put through a decade-long battery of tests, evaluations, and practice runs, the results of which we'll be covering in detail shortly. In 2019, the Starliner would finally take its first unmanned spaceflight, and it at least began to seem as if the craft would one day bring astronauts to the stars. In order to understand all the myriad issues with the Starliner, we've also got to account for what the spacecraft is supposed to be. Its design, its purpose, its specs, that sort of thing. Well, look at it from the outside. The Starliner is a stubby little craft, one that looks as if it's a world apart from the airliners that Boeing has long made its bread and butter. It's a two-part craft with a reusable, conical capsule where the crew is supposed to sit, plus a service module, an expendable component of the spacecraft that provides propulsion and the capacity to generate power. When it includes both its crew capsule and its service module, the whole apparatus measures just 16.5 feet, a hair over 5 meters in length, while the crew capsule features a diameter at its base of just 15 feet or 4.5 meters. Nonetheless, the crew capsule has room for up to 7 passengers in total, or in the event that not all seats are needed, it can carry a mix of crew and cargo. Featuring a maximum launch mass of 29,000 pounds or 13,000 kilograms, the Starliner is capable of surviving up to 60 hours in free flight, that is, using its internal reserves of oxygen and other stored supplies. Docked to the International Space Station, it's meant to last for 210 days before needing to be serviced. And under the hood, the capsule gets yet more impressive.
Well, I mean, 80 hours? Do you say 80 hours of O2? 60, sorry, 60 hours of O2. I mean, 60 hours of O2? It's, do the math. That's basically about 2.5 days. You've got about 2.5 days of oxygen in the module alone, which typically is enough for its usage. Yeah, it's 2.5 days. But that is typically enough usage for launch and then dock with the space station, and then you're out in the space station. But it's still a very finite amount. That's why the issue with those thrusters when it was trying to dock with the space station was that was a pucker up the butthole kind of moment, because they can't dock with the space station. They've only got so much air in those tanks. So, and he may go over that.
Days before needing to be serviced. And under the hood, the capsule gets yet more impressive. It's built with endurance and reuse in mind, with the potential to complete up to 10 reuse launches in intervals of 6 months, thus granting each manufactured capsule the potential to serve for about 5 years before being retired. Boeing intends to use 2 crew modules for the duration of the Starliner program, carrying out roughly 4 launches per year. On board, it features Wi-Fi and tablet technology for the astronauts on board. It's fitted with a nose cone compatible with all NASA systems, meaning that in theory it could dock with just about anything else NASA puts into orbit in the next few years, not just the ISS. The service module is fitted with solar cells plus 4 engines of its own, loaded with propellant that's kept in reserve until and unless an abort is ever required. The capsule
Shadow Claw, I would imagine so, where he was saying it lasted 400 some odd days before needing service. I imagine that is likely the reason. It is, stress on the frame. I'd say that probably is why. That'd be my suspicion.
Uses a so-called weldless, spun-formed structure to eliminate stress points and enhance its survivability, while it's fitted with something called an aeroskirt for launch, with the aeroskirt reducing the barrage of shockwaves that the craft is battered with when it lifts off. After launch, it uses a suborbital trajectory just below orbital velocity in order to drop its upper stage rockets in a safe and predictable path toward Earth, and then it lifts into orbit with its final booster stage. Judging by what the Starliner is, on paper, it outwardly appears more than able to fulfill the complex task of space station rendezvous, handling both launch and re-entry with little trouble at all. Though the program was slated for some 20-odd launches, with 2 crewed spacecraft built, it could well have been the first step in a long line of NASA-Boeing collaboration, procuring more spacecraft or evolving into new iterations as time went on. Yet in reality, the story of the Starliner has gone a very different way, and with the idea of what the Starliner was meant to be now in full view, it's time to transition into what the Starliner has been, and, well, what it could still become. Now, Starliner's long line of delays were a problem that started early, and were a problem that at first didn't really seem to be Boeing's fault. After being selected and given a whole lot of money in 2014, the Commercial Crew Program set Boeing on an ambitious timeline to launch the Starliner, just about 3 years. By that time, the Starliner had to be fully certified, a process that would have involved at least 1 crewed test flight with a NASA astronaut on board. That's the sort of schedule that certainly sounds really nice, but as our sister channel Mega Projects has taught us well by now, it's not nearly so simple to build a whole new sort of technology by just being really aspirational and go-getting. Boeing had worked
Hopes and dreams. Hopes and dreams. Yeah. Hopes and dreams don't change reality.
with the US government on the Apollo program, the Space Shuttle, and the International Space Station, but it had never built a spacecraft on its own before. The one it was building now was tasked with representing an entire nation and carrying living, breathing crew members in a field with a long history of dangerous and sometimes fatal space flights. The problem, though, was that Boeing had competition, and to explain why that matters, we're handed over to Elisha Sars, writing for Mashable in June 2024, quoting her here, "If someone had told NASA a decade ago that SpaceX would build a new ride for astronauts to get to the International Space Station before Boeing, the space agency, might have laughed that person out of the room." NASA hired both companies to make spaceships in 2014. SpaceX, the inexperienced one, got its Crew Dragon to the finish line first and has carried 50 people to orbit since 2020. Meanwhile, Boeing has continued toiling with the Starliner, playing a veritable game of whack-a-mole to address one engineering problem after another, most recently a small helium leak in its service module. Now, look, we'll be getting back to that helium leak in just a little bit, but for now, the important thing to understand is that Boeing's Starliner
I remember
project
hearing
is
about
a subject of never-ending contrast with the SpaceX project, an endeavor that certainly had its own issues, but got to a point of proven spaceflight success long before Boeing's Capsule ever lifted off. And nor did Boeing help itself either. All the way back in 2010, Boeing had set expectations high, indicating that it could have an operational Starliner as early as 2015, by which time, in reality, Boeing had barely even gotten to naming the thing. When it came to the Starliner project, the problems seemed to come from two primary
Very true,
factors,
Ace.
and a lack
Very
of
true.
external confidence. The external confidence problem is a bit easier to understand and quicker to sum up, so we'll start there. There was a long line of knocks on the program that primarily came from the US government. It's certainly not a shock that NASA might have felt a bit skeptical. After all, Starliner became a troubled program fairly early on, and at a time when NASA risked major funding cuts and would have caught the public blame for a catastrophe, we imagine it must have been easy to look at Starliner and be rather concerned. In 2015, an uncrewed variant of the Starliner got slashed from another NASA commercial procurement initiative, the Commercial Resupply Services Competition, which would have seen the Starliner used to bring cargo into space with no crew presence. In 2018, NASA was the one to break the news that a launch planned to happen just months later, at the time of its announcement, likely wouldn't happen until 2019 or even 2020. NASA would also reveal that it had intended to use the Starliner to fill a critical gap in International Space Station flights in 2019, paying extra to Boeing in the process, but that news came out after the window for those space flights had come and gone, with the Starliner, well, nowhere to be found. The last revelation even left a couple of minor bruises on both NASA and Boeing when NASA's own Inspector General criticized the agency for paying Boeing extra for the staggeringly expensive Starliner without ever offering SpaceX an opportunity to present an alternate solution for the issue. Per the NASA IG, the organization may have been paying extra to keep Boeing from pulling out of the Commercial Crew program entirely, with unnamed NASA officials allegedly believing that, quoting here, due to financial considerations, Boeing could not continue as a commercial crew provider until the contractor received the higher prices.
So are they really pulling this kind of bullshit instead of let's go with the one that can do the better job? Like, that's what this is feeling like at this point. It's that, NASA really wanted Boeing in because they didn't want to acknowledge that Elon had beat the shit out of them in every way with his SpaceX things. Yeah, Mad Dog, I'm smelling the same thing too. Like, who was getting kickbacks at this point? That is a question that does need to get asked, because the fact that SpaceX had a well-proven track record at this point, and Boeing had nothing. Yeah, it's their defense contractor. NASA is government. Someone above NASA on the Hill was pulling the strings. Someone on the Hill was definitely pulling the strings and saying, nope, you gotta give it to Boeing because we don't want to hurt Boeing's feelings because they're our defense contractor. Yeah, it's I like there is 100% something rotten going on here. Maybe he'll go into that, but oh yeah, this definitely feels like something's happening on inside that's not being told to everybody. And who knows, maybe that whistleblower had something to say about it, and that's why they did away with it. Who knows?
Boeing higher-ups denied having an interest in withdrawing. But no amount of less than helpful contributions from NASA could have delayed the Starliner nearly as badly as the many engineering and mechanical issues that arose during the development process. Now, those really started to pick up around 2018, when in July of that year, tests revealed that a wide range of valve issues had compromised the Starliner's abort system, the critical mechanism by which the capsule could be saved from a destructive impact if something went wrong. A few months later, NASA warnings to both Boeing and SpaceX about safety concerns led the first launch to be pushed back yet again. Toward the end of 2019, the capsule suffered a problem during powered abort tests when one of 3 parachutes that would have saved it if it had to be jettisoned away from a failing launch vehicle ended up failing, while thick orange propellant smoke blanketed the recovery site where the capsule came to rest. Despite the failure, the capsule was able to land on 2 parachutes, and despite public worry that a failed parachute opening really seemed like an issue worth addressing, it was not considered to be worth further delays. But the highest profile failure for the Starliner, by far, came during its maiden voyage in December 2019. Initially, the spaceflight seemed as if it was going well. The uncrewed capsule launched into orbit on the back of an Atlas V rocket as expected, with the expectation that it would rendezvous with the ISS. However, a software glitch caused a bigger fuel burn than anticipated, wasting enough of its precious propellant that it was unable to get to the ISS in orbit. The mission wasn't a total loss. The craft was able to complete some of the required tests, and a sensor-packed dummy validated the idea that a person could ride in the thing without experiencing a catastrophe. In fact, the capsule even earned the distinction of being the first American space capsule to land on the soil of the continental United States, touching down in the White Sands Missile Range and National Park in New Mexico. But it didn't achieve its primary mission objective, and despite a degree of forgiveness and empathy from the rest of the aerospace community, even SpaceX founder Elon Musk, the failure was still yet another problem and yet another delay for Boeing and NASA. Reviews of the incident revealed that there had been a second, quote, critical software defect.
Shadow? Not the place for that. Remember my rules. I have them for a reason. Do not make me bonk.
defect, and that both of the defects, which were caught and corrected in time, could have led to the destruction of the capsule if they'd been missed. The other issue would have led to an unsafe thrust firing sequence when it came time to detach the capsule from the service module. The incident would result in a 7-month investigation and a long list of 80 corrections from NASA in order to get back on track. Implementing those changes would take yet more months, setting the program back into the 2020s. And when the problems were finally all fixed and the craft was ready for launch again in 2021, disaster struck again. This time the launch was called off from the launch pad because of over a dozen corroded valves all up and down the Starliner's propulsion system, a problem that could easily have led to a range of catastrophic issues if it had been allowed to launch. Each part had to be replaced, and launch was delayed another year in order to cope. The Starliner was finally able to launch again in May of 2022, and to it and its programmer's credit, it was able to complete a successful.
Well, Mad Dog, supposedly they did, but one of those tests was a failure. Their test that he was saying is that they did too long of they did too much of a fuel burn, and when it got into space, it couldn't actually reach the ISS like it was supposed to. So I mean, that was a test because that was an unmanned capsule. So they are testing, and we're seeing failures. But these failures are not being corrected, and new ones are cropping up all the fucking time, it sounds like. It begs the question, why the hell? Yeah, it's like test failed successfully. Oh yeah, all of these begging a question, like, how was this program allowed to continue? And I think we all know the answer to that, but it's like, that's where the questions are starting to come into play.
Successful flight to the ISS and returned safe and sound. But even during that flight, more issues were revealed. 2 of the spacecraft's thrusters failed during its final burn when it was inserted to orbit, and thrusters that were meant to maneuver it during its docking procedure failed due to low pressure, while thermal systems on board indicated extra cold temperatures. For the following months, the Starliner was refitted and put through its checks yet again.
Bear in mind, the thruster failure he was just talking about? That's what happened with the latest flight when they were trying to get to the ISS. The thrusters failed again. Holy fuck. Boeing is not doing well. They haven't been doing well for a while now. They need to get out of the space program. They 100%, Boeing needs to get out of space. Focus on your planes, you got enough problems there. They need to get out of the space industry. Because they can't do it. They've proven they can't do it.
Again, in preparation for what would eventually be a crewed flight. But just when it seemed as if the Starliner might finally be ready for a crewed mission, it had to be put on ice yet again. This time, a pre-launch review revealed a whole range of minor issues, which, when combined, contributed to even more months of delays. Among the problems was that a mile or so of internal wiring had to have its covering tape replaced because the covering tape Boeing had initially used was apparently flammable. Those delays would set the program back for nearly another year for an intended launch date on May the 6th, 2024. On that day, 2 hours prior to the launch, the flight was cancelled because of an issue with an oxygen valve on the Atlas V rocket, and during the launch attempt, crews discovered an additional helium leak in the service module.
I think I remember hearing about that too. With that cancellation, I do believe I recall hearing about that. Because I think they mentioned it with the launch that I actually saw, the recent launch that I actually saw. They mentioned the cancellation because of the leaks.
Test flight was rescheduled for June the 1st, but it would be cancelled just minutes before liftoff after a long series of ground team technical issues ultimately ended with the whole spaceflight being called off. But after its many setbacks, despite its many technical issues, and in a testament to the teams of engineers and scientists that had stuck with the Starliner across its decade-long saga, the day finally came for liftoff. That day was June the 6th, 2024, and on that day, the Starliner finally achieved what it had been made for all those years ago. We named them before, and we'll name them again. Veteran astronaut Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams. They would be Starliner's 2-person crew for a roughly day-long spaceflight that would conclude with their arrival to the International Space Station. They'd dock with the ISS as scheduled, with the Starliner completing its autonomous procedure and its 2 crew members joining their 7 compatriots on board a rather crowded ISS. Even in this case, the Starliner still revealed that it had some surprises in store, and not the sort that you'd like if you're an astronaut on board. After a successful launch and orbital insertion burn, plus some tests from Wilmore and Williams to see how the craft handled under piloted control, 2 new helium leaks were discovered from the propulsion system while the astronauts had been asleep. The anomaly caused the first docking attempt with the ISS to be aborted at a distance of about 200 meters, with the astronauts flying in manual mode in order to keep up with it for an hour.
I remember, I think that's part of that is what we watched live on stream. Is when they had this issue where their docking had to get aborted, and they had to just fly manually to keep up with it. That was I think that was the part that we watched live on stream when I had it up and showing on the stream. That one day.
Hour and 15 minutes until the next window for a potential docking arrived. The second docking window would get a green light as it was assessed to be safe for the craft to proceed despite the issue, yet it was still another indicator that there's work left to be done on the Starliner in the long term. Fixable or not, it stands to reason that a new problem arising aboard the Starliner in what was supposed to be the flight that went just right shouldn't inspire confidence that there are no more issues to come. At the time of writing, Williams and Wilmore are still aboard the ISS, and a mission slated to last just 8 days and focus mostly on clearing the Starliner for future operations. In the process, they'll test the Starliner's solar arrays, its onboard computers and power systems, its airtight seals to the ISS, and its ability to function as a sort of lifeboat for the ISS crew if something were to go wrong aboard the station. Depending on conditions on Earth or in space, Williams and Wilmore could end up on board the ISS for up to a month or more, but at present, they're expected to come back safely and quickly in order to turn the craft around for final checks. In an ideal world, this will be the final testing sequence before the Starliner is cleared to enter full service, and not a moment too soon. With the Starliner seeming like it's been right on the threshold of readiness for years, it's already penciled into NASA's schedule for upcoming space flights, and at this point, it would be entirely reasonable for NASA to expect that the Starliner's problems should be put behind it for good. When it comes to the Starliner's role in space, its destiny in the short term seems to be already decided. This time, NASA has Boeing on the hook for at least 6 scheduled Starliner transports to the ISS once a year between 2025 and 2030, and the 2 Starliner capsules should have a combined 20 total flights if need be. With 6-month turnaround times between space flights for each capsule, that could conceivably see the Starliner performing shuttle flights up to 4 times annually, but in reality the capsules will stay a while at the ISS each time that they go up there. As mentioned previously, they fill an important function as a sort of lifeboat, ready and able to ferry astronauts back to Earth if the ISS were ever to be compromised. From NASA's perspective, Starliner also guarantees a critical redundancy. Say, for example, that a severe enough problem came up with the Dragon capsule that the whole fleet had to be grounded. Now, NASA can deal with that problem by using the Starliner and vice versa. In the event that the Starliner is able to fulfill its mission role with both competency and consistency, NASA may choose to book future transports to the ISS with the 2 Starliners currently in existence and could potentially even ask Boeing to make more. But if that's going to happen, it'll have to beat out the Dragon, a spacecraft that's proven its worth in transporting both NASA and commercial customers at a far higher clip than the Starliner thus far. And speaking of commercial customers, the arrival of the Starliner into NASA service is a development that Boeing clearly hopes will lead to contracts of another sort. As the BBC put it in a May 2024 article quoting here, Boeing's Starliner website reads like a car brochure. Among Boeing's selling points are more than just the Starliner's modern software and its ability to travel to space. It's also advertised to potential passengers on the basis of the amount of space inside, with the potential to travel with up to...
I'm sorry, but right now, I do not want my aeronautical space vehicle to be presented to me like a fucking car. Like, no, this is a spacefaring vehicle. And right now, we should not be thinking about bringing people into space with these things. So I don't want it presented to me like a car. 'Cause I'm not getting in one of the fucking things. You will not find me eager to get into one of these things. Like, this is where it's showing, yeah, exactly, Yardbot, maybe in 100 years. In which case, most of us, if not all of us, will all be dead. But, I mean, this is very telling in terms of where their focus is. Their focus should be on dealing with this plethora of issues that has been cropping up with their vehicle. It should not be on making a car sales pitch. Fix your fucking issues, then you can worry about selling me on it. Until I know, like, okay, there's only a small hiccup here and there that can happen with any spacefaring vehicle. Until you get to that point, I don't want to fucking hear from you. I don't want you to sell me on shit. I want you to fix your shit and make sure it works right. Then you can try and sell me on it.
7 people on board, along with the comfortable and stylish spacesuits that Boeing has made sure to provide. Not only that, but in theory at least, the Starliner's availability should drive down the cost of human spaceflight, making it possible for a wider range of customers and individuals to make their own voyage to the cosmos. Not only will that provide some really nice options for billionaires to flex on their friends, but it'll open up the possibility of establishing a real market in low Earth orbit. NASA hopes that competition between SpaceX and Boeing will lower the costs required for private companies to take crew and cargo to space, dramatically reducing the financial and logistical load that NASA manages by itself. And when it comes time for ISS to retire at a yet unspecified date toward the end of the 2020s, the Starliner will likely be critical in building the thing that comes next. According to a range of global space agencies, the plan is for the next generation of space stations to be privately designed and built, with as many space stations operating as the private sector is interested in creating. Governmental space agencies will still use those stations, but they'll be used for private industry as well. The UK Space Agency's head of space exploration, Libby Jackson, describes, quote, opportunities to develop new materials, new drugs that you could only manufacture in space. Between the Starliner, the Dragon, and the joint Lockheed Martin and Airbus capsule that's called the Orion, slated for use in the Artemis series of lunar missions, the space industry is going to have its choice of 3 transport options to realize all their ambitions. Depending on how interested the private sector actually is in going to space, that could see Boeing asked to build Starliner capsules on the scale that it builds Boeing 737s within the next decade or two. But when it comes to the
And given their current track record, I'm not sure we want them to start going into mass production. I mean, yeah, given Boeing's current track record with their 737s and 747s, do we really want them mass producing space vehicles right now? I don't.
Starliner's impact on affairs here on Earth, the result is a bit less positive for Boeing, at least in the short term. We imagine it's no surprise to many of our viewers today, but Boeing's been dealing with a little bit of a rough patch recently. That started with the crashes of 2 737 MAX aircraft, resulting in the deaths of 346 people and a pretty massive scandal. The planes have had myriad other issues, including a door plug blowing out on an Alaska Airlines flight in January 2024. And not one, but 2 Boeing whistleblowers died within just months of each other in the spring of the same year, in something that we, for reasons of legal ambiguity, are going to describe as a bit of a spicy coincidence. In an ideal world,
No, I don't have such restrictions. This was not a coincidence. I'm not that restricted. I will flat out say it does not sound like a coincidence. But is anything gonna be done? No. No, it's not. And we all know why. Boeing is a defense contractor, so they're gonna get protected. And that's all there is to it.
a seamless, flashy Starliner program would have been a nice counterweight to all the nasty stuff. But if anything's been clear for Boeing in the last few years, it's that they won't be enjoying the conditions of their ideal world anytime soon. Instead, the Starliner has bogged down the space wing of the company with all the same troubles and headaches facing its aviation wing. The myriad issues of the Starliner's creation have tended to echo the parts trouble, the engineering problems, and the failure to meet expectations that global consumers have become accustomed to in Boeing's aircrafts, in keeping with a slow and difficult shift of the company's reputation. Boeing is already estimated to have lost northward of $1.5 billion on the Starliner project, and there's no telling how much more these costs could rise if additional issues emerge. NASA's estimated cost per Starliner use is about $90 million as compared to the SpaceX Dragon, which, when seating crew, costs only $55 million. And in fact, all of the Starliner's troubles are made worse because of that Dragon comparison, with a mental image of a smirking Elon Musk flying circles around Boeing executives. All too easy to imagine. But earthly politics aside, it's important to remember that future successes with the Starliner, if indeed those successes do happen, are good for everyone. A success for Starliner is a success for humanity's ambitions in space in the decades to come, a vital step in taking the burden for space travel off of the backs of world nations and shifting it into the hands of organizations with the money, the will, and the vision to do things that those same space agencies have wanted to do, but have realized they simply can't do in today's world. This next chapter of humanity's future in space could very well be a glorious one, but it's clear that global governments aren't going to be able to make that future happen all by themselves. They won't have to if the Starliner can help lead the way. And if it can, then the world's going to be better for it.
I'm going to disagree with one very specific thing he said there at the end. Putting the burden of space travel like this on private companies as opposed to the nations themselves is not going to take the strain off taxpayers. Because what's going to end up happening is, yes, if private companies are the ones that start being the ones to build and use the spacecraft, you don't think they're going to get fuck tons of tax breaks or funding from the government in some way? Of course they are. This is not going to be a break for the taxpayers. It's just going, the costs are going to be hidden in some kind of financial gobbledygook that it would take a forensic financial investigator to uncover what the money's actually being spent on. So no, I don't buy for a second that that private companies taking over the building of the spacecraft is going to be any kind of an ease of burden on the country itself. Not a fucking chance in hell.